Part 2. The Age of Gods and God-Kings, the Early Dynastic Period and Old Kingdom. Chapter 1. What it meant to be a pharaoh. There is a question that sits at the very heart of ancient Egyptian civilization, a question so fundamental that almost everything else about that remarkable world flows from it like tributaries from a river. And the question is this: what was a pharaoh? Not in the administrative sense, not the list of titles and duties and ritual obligations, though those are interesting enough in their own right, but in the deeper, more essential sense. What did the ancient Egyptians understand their king to be? What did they believe, in the quiet interior of their religious imagination, was the nature of the being who sat on the throne, who wore the double crown, who carried the crook and the flail and gazed out at them from the walls of every temple in the land with that particular expression of serene, slightly distant authority that is one of the most recognizable faces in all of human art? The answer is both simpler and more extraordinary than we might expect, and it is this: the pharaoh was a god. Not a representative of the gods, not a favorite of the gods, not even simply a king chosen by the gods to rule in their name, though all of those formulations were also true and also part of the complex theology of Egyptian kingship. The pharaoh was understood to be, in his own person, a divine being, the living embodiment on earth of the god Horus, the falcon-headed deity who was the patron of the living king and the son of the great gods Osiris and Isis. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris, joining the company of the divine dead and ruling over the realm of the afterlife, while his successor, the new king, became the new Horus. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, the same divine essence passing from one royal body to the next, maintaining the unbroken chain of divine kingship that held the cosmic order together. This was not a metaphor. This was not a political fiction or a propaganda construct in the cynical modern sense, a story told to keep the people compliant and the ruler in power. The ancient Egyptians believed it with the same wholehearted, unironic conviction with which people in other times and places have believed their own most fundamental religious truths. The pharaoh was divine. His word was, quite literally, the word of God. His commands had the force of cosmic law, and his well-being, his health, his strength, his continued existence was directly connected to the well-being of the entire world. This theological concept, which Egyptologists call the divine kingship, was the organizing principle of Egyptian civilization, the idea around which everything else was arranged. It explained why the temples were built and why the priests maintained their elaborate daily rituals. It explained why the entire agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley was, in theory and often in practice, the property of the king and was redistributed through the royal administration. It explained why armies marched and why canals were dug and why the great stone monuments were raised. All of it, ultimately, was in service of the divine king and the cosmic order that he embodied and maintained. The word pharaoh itself, we should note, is not an ancient Egyptian royal title. It comes from the Egyptian per-aa, meaning the great house, which originally referred not to the king himself, but to the royal palace. The institution of the monarchy, the state apparatus, in the same way that we might speak of the White House or Downing Street as shorthand for the government they house. The use of per-aa to refer to the king himself developed only in the later period of Egyptian history, around the New Kingdom, and the term pharaoh as we commonly use it is really a Greek rendering of the Egyptian, filtered through the Hebrew of the Old Testament and passed down to us through the long chain of classical and biblical scholarship. The Egyptians themselves had a rich and elaborate vocabulary of royal titles, and the full formal title of the pharaoh comprised 5 names, each prefaced by a different title and each expressing a different aspect of the king's divine and political identity. The Horus name identified him with the falcon god. The Nebti name placed him under the protection of the vulture and the cobra goddesses. The golden Horus name expressed his divine radiance. The throne name, preceded by the title Son of Ra, identified him as the offspring of the sun god. And the birth name, the name he had been given as a child before he became king, was also preserved, set within an oval loop called a cartouche that modern archaeologists and Egyptologists have used for centuries to identify and read royal names in hieroglyphic inscriptions. The cartouche, that elegant oval of rope with a horizontal bar at one end, enclosing the hieroglyphs of the royal name, is one of those small details of Egyptian civilization that repays a moment of reflection. The rope loop represents, in the thinking of the ancient Egyptians, the circuit of the sun around the earth, the endless cycle of the cosmic order, and to write the pharaoh's name inside that loop was to say, in visual form, that the king was contained within and protected by the cosmic order, that his name and his existence were bound up with the eternal cycles of the universe. It was a profound statement, made in the seemingly modest medium of an administrative label. The daily life of the pharaoh was structured around ritual obligations that expressed and reinforced his divine nature. Each morning, in temples across Egypt, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony on the sacred statue of the king, touching its lips with special instruments to restore its ability to eat and speak and breathe. Because the statue was not merely a representation of the pharaoh, but was understood to contain something of his divine essence, to be a kind of secondary body in which his spirit could reside. The pharaoh himself, in his palace, performed his own morning rituals, was bathed and dressed and fed by a retinue of attendants, and emerged to hold court and receive petitions and conduct the business of the state with the combination of religious ceremony and practical administration that characterized Egyptian governance. The pharaoh was, among other things, the chief priest of every temple in Egypt. In theory, it was the king who performed every sacred ritual, who offered every sacrifice, who spoke every prayer. In practice, of course, a single man could not be in dozens of temples at once, and the actual performance of the rituals was delegated to the professional priesthood. But the delegation was understood to be exactly that, a delegation, with the actual authority and efficacy of the ritual residing in the person of the king even when his physical presence was elsewhere. This is why the walls of Egyptian temples are covered with images of the pharaoh performing rituals before the gods, not as straightforward historical records of specific events, but as theological statements about the nature of the king and his relationship with the divine. The pharaoh was also, of course, the supreme military commander, the judge and lawgiver, the source of all legitimate authority in the land. But what made Egyptian kingship distinctive, what set it apart from other ancient monarchies and gave it its particular character, was always this insistence on the divine nature of the king, the belief that the man on the throne was not merely a powerful human being who happened to rule a large and prosperous kingdom, but a genuinely different order of being, a bridge between the human and the divine, the point where the two worlds met and were held together. This belief had practical consequences that shaped the texture of Egyptian life in ways both large and small. It meant that the stability of the state was understood to be cosmically guaranteed, that the same divine power that ensured the sun would rise each morning and the Nile would flood each year also ensured that Egypt would endure, as long as the proper rituals were performed and the divine king was properly honored. It meant that rebellion against the pharaoh was not merely treason, but sacrilege, a crime against the cosmic order itself. And it meant that the death of a pharaoh was a cosmic event of the first magnitude, a moment when the fabric of reality itself was briefly rent, when the world was without its divine center, and the period between one pharaoh's death and his successor's coronation was understood to be a time of peculiar danger and instability, a time when chaos might seize its opportunity. All of this, the theology, the ritual, the cosmic stakes, was the foundation on which the early dynastic period was built, the framework within which the first kings of a unified Egypt understood themselves and were understood by their people. And it was within this framework that the extraordinary cultural and architectural achievements of the Old Kingdom would eventually emerge, achievements that can only be fully understood when we remember the profoundly serious theological intentions that lay behind them. But first, there was the work of building a state. Chapter 2. The Early Dynastic Period, Dynasties 1 and 2. The world that Narmer and his successors inherited was, for all its promise, a demanding and complicated one. Unification had been achieved, or at least proclaimed. The palette had been carved, the double crown had been worn, the capital had been established at Memphis, but achieving political unity and maintaining it were very different challenges, and the rulers of the first and second dynasties faced the second of these challenges with a persistence and resourcefulness that deserves rather more credit than it typically receives. Egypt in the early dynastic period, roughly the 4 centuries between about 3100 and 2686 BCE, was a land in the process of becoming itself, of working out the institutional and administrative and cultural arrangements that would define it for millennia to come. It was a time of invention and experiment, of the gradual crystallization of forms, artistic, religious, architectural, bureaucratic, that would eventually harden into the distinctive and remarkably stable civilization we recognize as ancient Egypt. Memphis, the new capital, was the center of all of this activity. Situated at the apex of the delta, where the narrow Nile Valley opens out into the broad fan of the delta channels, Memphis occupied perhaps the most strategically significant piece of ground in all of Egypt, and it grew rapidly in the early dynastic period into a substantial city, the administrative hub of the new kingdom, home to the palace and the court, and the expanding bureaucracy of officials and scribes that the management of a large state required. The early pharaohs were buried not at Memphis, but at Abydos in the south, at the site that had been the traditional burial place of the pre-dynastic rulers of Upper Egypt. This choice of burial location was itself a statement, a claim of continuity with the southern kings from whom the unifiers had sprung, an assertion of the legitimacy of the new dynasty by rooting it in the sacred ground of its predecessors. The royal tombs at Abydos grew more elaborate with each generation, the underground chambers becoming larger and more numerous, the grave goods richer and more varied, the funerary ceremonies more complex and more costly. Among the most striking features of the early dynastic royal burials is the evidence they provide for human sacrifice, or at least for the burial of large numbers of attendants alongside the king. The tomb of the first dynasty Pharaoh Djoser, for example, was surrounded by the graves of several hundred individuals, mostly young adults, who appear to have been killed specifically to accompany the king into the afterlife, to serve him in death as they had served him in life. This practice, which seems to have been abandoned by the end of the first dynasty, speaks to a particularly intense and literal understanding of the continuity between life and death, a belief that the king would need, in whatever realm he was going to, the same things he had needed in this one, including the services of living human beings. The administrative apparatus of the early state was centered on the institution of the royal household, the Per-Aa, or Great House, from which the word pharaoh would eventually derive. The running of this household, the management of the king's estates, the collection and redistribution of agricultural surplus, the organization of labor for construction projects and other state enterprises, required a growing body of specialized officials, and it was the needs of this administration that drove the rapid development of writing and record-keeping in the early dynastic period. The hieroglyphic script, already present in rudimentary form at the very beginning of the First Dynasty, developed rapidly during these centuries, expanding from a small set of administrative symbols into a rich and complex system capable of expressing a wide range of meanings. Alongside the monumental hieroglyphs carved into stone, for public inscriptions, for temple walls, for the labels on royal monuments, a faster, more cursive form of writing developed for use on papyrus and other more perishable materials, a script that we call hieratic, and that was used by the scribes who maintained the administrative records of the state. The scribes were among the most important figures in early Egyptian society, and they were treated accordingly. To be literate in ancient Egypt was to have access to a world of power and privilege that was closed to the overwhelming majority of the population, and the training of scribes, which was a long, rigorous, and demanding process involving years of copying texts and practicing the hundreds of hieroglyphic signs, was one of the most important educational institutions in the land. A boy who became a scribe could look forward to a career of comfortable employment in the royal administration, relatively free from the back-breaking physical labor that was the lot of most Egyptians, and the literature of ancient Egypt is full of texts extolling the virtues of the scribal profession and the wisdom of choosing it over any other. The Second Dynasty, which followed the first in circumstances that are somewhat obscure to us, appears to have been a period of some political tension, perhaps involving conflicts over succession or disputes between regional factions, the details of which are largely lost to us. A king named Khâsekhemoui, who ruled at the end of the Second Dynasty, appears to have reunified a kingdom that had experienced some degree of fragmentation, and his name, which means the two powerful ones appear, seems to reference this reunification, the two powerful ones being Horus and Set, the divine forces associated with Upper and Lower Egypt respectively, their combined appearance suggesting a reconciliation of the two parts of the kingdom. Khâsekhemoui is an interesting figure for another reason as well. He is the earliest Egyptian king of whom we have a realistic portrait statue, a pair of seated limestone and schist figures that show a compact, powerful man with strong features, wearing the white crown and holding his hands flat on his thighs in the pose that would become standard for royal seated statues for the next 3,000 years. There is something quietly moving about these statues, something in the directness of their gaze and the solidity of their forms that makes the man who commissioned them feel, across a distance of 5,000 years, almost present. And it was from Khâsekhemoui, or from the court he established and the traditions he consolidated, that there came, through channels that are not entirely clear to us, the man who would change the world. Chapter 3: Djoser and the Step Pyramid, the world's first monument. His name was Djoser, and he ruled Egypt during the Third Dynasty, probably around 2670 to 2650 BCE, and he did something that no human being had ever done before. He ordered the construction of a building so large, so ambitious, so unprecedented in its conception, that even today, nearly 5,000 years later, it stops you in your tracks. The Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara is the world's first monumental stone structure, the first large building ever raised by human hands from quarried stone, and it stands today, still standing, still recognizable for what it was and what it meant, on the desert plateau of Saqqara, just west of Memphis, a great stepped mountain of limestone rising against the Egyptian sky with a kind of quiet authority that has nothing to do with its comparative modesty next to the later pyramids of Giza, and everything to do with the sheer audacity of its existence. Before Djoser, royal tombs were built of mud brick. The mastaba, from the Arabic word for bench, which the form of these structures suggests to modern eyes, was a low, flat-topped rectangular mound of mud brick covering an underground burial chamber, the traditional form of elite burial since the earliest dynasties. Mud brick was the building material of Egypt, cheap and plentiful, and entirely adequate for the construction of houses and palaces and even temples, and there was no particular reason before Djoser to think that anything else was needed. What changed was a man named Imhotep. Imhotep was Djoser's vizier, his chief minister, the most powerful official in the kingdom after the king himself, and he was also, apparently, a man of quite extraordinary intellectual and practical gifts, a designer and engineer and administrator of genius whose ideas were so far ahead of their time that they reshaped the physical landscape of Egypt, and whose reputation was so great that later generations would venerate him as a god of wisdom and medicine and healing. We know surprisingly little about Imhotep, the historical person. He appears in a handful of inscriptions from Djoser's reign, one of which is a remarkable statue base from Saqqara that lists his titles in a way that gives us a sense of the breadth of his responsibilities and his gifts, describing him as Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, first after the King of Upper Egypt, Administrator of the Great Palace, Hereditary Nobleman, High Priest of Heliopolis, Builder, Sculptor, and Maker of Vases in Chief. It is a formidable list, and the inclusion of builder and sculptor among his official titles is suggestive. These were not typical designations for a vizier, and their presence suggests that Imhotep's design work was understood by his contemporaries to be among the most important things about him. The story of how Imhotep came to design the step pyramid, if it is a story rather than a gradual process, is not one we can tell in any detail, because the records are simply not there. What we can see in the archaeological record is the process by which the structure grew and changed during its construction, expanding through a series of stages from something that began as a modified mastaba into the six-stepped limestone mountain that stands today. And this visible record of revision and expansion suggests a mind actively working, actively experimenting, pushing the possibilities of stone construction into territory that had never been explored. The pyramid itself is only the most visible element of a much larger complex, a walled enclosure of some 15 hectares, originally surrounded by a fine limestone boundary wall with 14 false doors and one real entrance, containing within it a range of structures associated with the king's mortuary cult and with the celebration in the afterlife of the said festival, the royal jubilee ceremony in which the pharaoh's power was ritually renewed. There are long galleries and shrines, ceremonial courtyards and dummy buildings, structures with carefully finished stone facades but no usable interior space, representations in permanent stone of the temporary structures that would have been erected for the actual said festival, made eternal for the king's use in the afterlife. This idea of creating in permanent stone a version of the world as it would be needed in eternity is one of the most characteristic impulses of Egyptian funerary architecture, and the Saqqara complex is one of its earliest and most complete expressions. The Egyptians believed that the afterlife was, in many ways, a continuation of life, and that the dead would need the same things they had needed in the world of the living: food and drink, shelter, servants, the ceremonies and celebrations that had given life its meaning. To provide all of these things in imperishable stone was to ensure that the dead king would want for nothing, that the world he inhabited for eternity would be as complete and as comfortable as the world he had inhabited in life. The underground chambers beneath the step pyramid are a labyrinth of corridors and rooms and shafts that were carved from the bedrock at enormous expense of labour and ingenuity, lined in places with fine limestone and with tiles of faience, the beautiful blue-green glazed material that the Egyptians associated with water and rebirth and the colour of the sky. Some of these underground chambers were decorated with panels of carved relief showing the king performing the said festival rituals, their fine limestone surfaces recording the royal ceremonies in the permanent medium of stone, ensuring that the magical power of the rituals would be available to the king forever. The entrance to the complex, the single real doorway in the long limestone enclosure wall, leads into a colonnaded hall of extraordinary beauty, its ceiling designed to look like wooden beams in stone, its walls lined with engaged columns that are the oldest known stone columns in the world. These columns are not freestanding. They are attached to the walls at their backs, as though the architect were not yet quite confident that stone columns could support themselves without the additional security of a wall behind them. And this slight hesitancy, this one small sign of uncertainty in an otherwise magnificently confident structure, is oddly touching, a reminder that Imhotep was working without precedent, without the accumulated tradition of stone column design to draw on, making it up as he went. And somehow, despite all the uncertainty, despite the lack of precedent, despite the sheer novelty of everything he was attempting, he got it breathtakingly right. The step pyramid complex at Saqqara is not merely the earliest monumental stone building in history. It is a genuinely beautiful and sophisticated architectural achievement, a place that rewards careful attention and slow exploration, that reveals new details and new subtleties the longer you spend in its company. The quality of the limestone craftsmanship is superb. The proportions of the enclosure and the pyramid within it are harmonious and satisfying, and the overall conception, the walled sacred precinct containing the tomb of the god king, everything oriented toward the eternal, everything built to last forever, is already fully Egyptian in its logic and its ambition. Djoser, for his part, seems to have been pleased. He was depicted in a seated statue found in a sealed chamber called the Serdab, adjacent to the pyramid, looking out through two small holes at the open sky. Or rather, his spirit was understood to inhabit that statue, and to look out through those holes at the offerings being made in the courtyard outside, receiving them through the medium of the stone effigy as nourishment for the eternal journey. The statue is one of the most powerful things in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a compact and commanding image of a man who understood himself to be a god and had the architecture to prove it. After Djoser, the step pyramid at Saqqara stood as a kind of challenge to every subsequent pharaoh, a monument to what was possible, an argument in stone for the ambitions that an Egyptian king might legitimately entertain. The kings who followed Djoser in the Third Dynasty attempted their own pyramid complexes with varying degrees of success, and by the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty, the great age of pyramid building was gathering its momentum, driven forward by a series of extraordinary rulers who would push the possibilities of stone construction further than they had ever gone, and further than they would ever go again. Chapter 4: Sneferu, the Great Pyramid Builder. The man who taught Egypt how to build a true pyramid was not, strictly speaking, the man we most associate with pyramids. He is not the name that springs to mind when people think of the great monuments at Giza, and his works, though enormous and extraordinary, are often overshadowed by the more famous structures that his son would go on to build. His name was Sneferu. He was the first pharaoh of the Fourth Dynasty and the father of the great Khufu, and he was, by the measure of sheer cubic tonnage of stone moved, the most prolific builder in Egyptian history. Sneferu came to the throne around 2613 BCE, and what followed was a reign of remarkable energy and ambition, a reign that would reshape the physical landscape of Egypt, transform Egyptian understanding of what pyramid building could achieve, and leave behind 3 pyramids and possibly parts of a 4th, an output of monumental construction that no pharaoh before or after him would match. His first pyramid was at Meidum, a site in the Fayum region south of Memphis, where he inherited or adopted a stepped pyramid that had been begun by his predecessor Huni, and that he appears to have expanded and eventually attempted to convert into a true pyramid. A smooth-sided pyramid with a flat triangular face rather than a series of distinct steps. The conversion, if that is what it was, did not go well. At some point, perhaps during construction, perhaps later, the outer casing of the Meidum pyramid collapsed, leaving the original stepped core exposed in the center of a vast pile of rubble, a striking and somewhat melancholy sight that stands today as a reminder that even the Egyptians, for all their architectural genius, had much to learn. If the Meidum collapse happened during Sneferu's reign, and not all scholars agree on when it occurred, then the king faced a moment of crisis and decision. He had invested enormous resources in a pyramid that had failed, and he was a long way from having the burial monument that a pharaoh of his ambitions required. His response was characteristic of a man of remarkable resourcefulness and determination. He simply started over, at a new site, and began again. The new site was Djoser, a stretch of desert plateau to the south of Saqqara, and it was here that Sneferu's most interesting and in some ways most revealing monuments were built. The first Djoser pyramid, the one we now call the Bent Pyramid, for reasons that become immediately obvious when you see it, was designed from the outset as a true pyramid, with smooth angled sides rising to a point. The bottom portion of the pyramid was built at an angle of about 54 degrees from the horizontal, a steep and ambitious inclination that gave the lower sections a satisfying sense of soaring height. But somewhere around the halfway point, something happened. Perhaps the engineers noticed signs of instability in the structure. Perhaps there were concerns about the weight bearing down on the burial chambers below. And the angle of the sides was abruptly changed to a much shallower 39 degrees, giving the pyramid its distinctive bent, kinked profile, a geometry that is unique in all of Egyptian architecture. The bent pyramid, for all its apparent imperfection, is a genuinely fascinating structure. It is the best preserved of all the Old Kingdom pyramids, its original smooth limestone casing still largely intact on the lower portions of its sides, and the interior burial chambers are among the most elaborate and technically sophisticated of any pyramid of the period, with corbelled ceilings of extraordinary skill, the ceiling stones arranged in overlapping tiers, each tier projecting slightly further inward than the one below, creating a tall, narrow, tent-like space above the burial chamber that distributes the weight of the stone above without requiring a horizontal span. But the bent pyramid was, in some sense, still an experiment, a structure that bore the visible marks of its own evolution, the evidence of decisions made and revised and reconsidered during construction. Sneferu, ever the pragmatist, began yet another pyramid at Djoser before the bent pyramid was complete, this one built at a consistent angle of 43 degrees from base to apex, a slope shallow enough to be stable, steep enough to be satisfying, and structurally confident in a way that none of its predecessors had managed to be. This pyramid, the Red Pyramid, named for the warm pink colour of its limestone core stones, is generally considered to be the first true pyramid in Egyptian history. A smooth-sided, geometrically consistent, structurally sound, pyramid-shaped pyramid, rising cleanly from the desert floor to a point with no bends, no steps, no visible hesitations or revisions. It is a large structure, about 105 meters tall at its original height, making it the third largest pyramid in Egypt. And it has a quiet authority, a sense of problem definitively solved, that the earlier experimental structures lack. Inside the Red Pyramid are 3 burial chambers, each roofed with a soaring corbelled vault like those of the Bent Pyramid, and in one of these chambers, archaeologists found fragments of a wooden coffin and traces of what may have been a royal mummy. tantalizing evidence that this may indeed have been the burial place of Sneferu himself, though the question of where exactly Sneferu was buried remains somewhat uncertain, given his unusual practice of building multiple pyramids. What Sneferu achieved over the course of his long reign, probably at least 40 years, possibly longer, was the solution to a problem that had defeated every previous pharaoh: how to build a stable, geometrically perfect, large-scale stone pyramid. He achieved this solution not through sudden inspiration or divine revelation, but through the patient, costly, sometimes painful process of trial and error, of building actual structures at enormous scale and seeing what happened, of learning from failures and applying the lessons to the next attempt. It was an empirical, practical, thoroughly human kind of genius, and it produced results of enduring magnificence. The lessons Sneferu's builders learned about the relationship between pyramid height and base width, about the optimal angle of inclination for stability, about the construction of internal chambers and the management of the immense compressive forces generated by millions of tons of stone, were passed on to the next generation of pyramid builders, who would apply them to projects of a scale and ambition that have never been surpassed. That next generation was led by Sneferu's son, who would rule as Khufu, the pharaoh we know better by his Greek name, Cheops, and who would look out at the desert plateau north of Memphis and decide, with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had inherited the knowledge of how to get it, that the time had come to build something truly extraordinary. But the pyramids of Giza belong to part 3. For now, as we continue our journey through the world of the Early Dynastic Period and the Old Kingdom, let us turn our attention to the life that surrounded and supported these great building endeavors, to the religion and the ritual and the elaborate machinery of the royal court that made Egypt, in this early period, one of the most sophisticated civilizations the world had yet produced. Chapter 5: The Sun Kings, Religion, Ra, and the Old Kingdom Court. The sky over ancient Egypt was rarely anything other than a deep and perfect blue, and on the days when the sun rode high above the desert, burning down on the limestone cliffs and the broad green ribbon of the floodplain with an intensity that made the air itself seem to shimmer and pulse with heat, there was something unavoidable, something almost insistent, about the presence of the solar disk above, something that demanded acknowledgement, demanded explanation, demanded to be understood. The ancient Egyptians understood it as a god. Ra, the sun god, the lord of the day sky, the father of the pharaoh, the greatest and most powerful of the divine forces that shaped the Egyptian world, was among the oldest and most fundamental of the Egyptian deities, and his importance only grew as the Old Kingdom developed and the ideology of divine kingship became more elaborate and more theologically sophisticated. By the time of the 4th dynasty, the period of the great pyramid builders, Ra had become so central to royal theology that the pharaoh was understood to be not merely the embodiment of Horus, but the son of Ra, the direct offspring of the sun god, born of divine lineage, carrying within himself the sacred solar essence that gave him his authority and his power. The sun's daily journey across the sky was understood as a profound and cosmically significant event, one that played out differently in different theological traditions, but that always involved the drama of light overcoming darkness, of order prevailing over chaos, of the divine force that sustained life prevailing each day over the forces that threatened to extinguish it. The sun rose in the east each morning, sailed across the sky in his great solar bark, the vessel of light in which Ra travelled the celestial ocean, and set in the west each evening, only to make a perilous journey through the underworld during the night, battling the serpent of chaos, Apophis, before emerging again at dawn, reborn and triumphant. This cycle, death and rebirth, darkness and light, the eternal return of the solar force, was the master metaphor of Egyptian religious thought, and it organized their understanding not only of the sun, but of human death and resurrection, of the agricultural cycle of planting and harvest, of the flood and recession of the Nile, of the entire rhythm of the world. Everything in the Egyptian cosmos was understood through the lens of this great cycle, this endless turning of light into darkness and darkness into light, and the pharaoh, as the son of Ra and the earthly embodiment of Horus, was understood to participate in and to guarantee the continuation of this cycle through his own ritual actions. The great solar temples of the Old Kingdom, built by the 5th dynasty pharaohs at Abu Ghurab and other sites north of Saqqara, were the physical expression of this solar theology. Vast open courtyards dominated by a massive stone obelisk that functioned as a petrified ray of sunlight, a solid, permanent embodiment of the solar force captured in stone. These temples were not housing structures, as most temples were, but open-air monuments to the sun, designed to catch and celebrate the light, rather than to shelter sacred images in the cool darkness of inner sanctuaries. But the theology of the Old Kingdom court was not purely solar. The Egyptian religious imagination was enormously rich and tolerant of complexity and apparent contradiction, and the court of the Old Kingdom pharaoh was a place where multiple theological traditions coexisted and interpenetrated, where the solar theology of Heliopolis, the great religious center near Memphis where Ra's cult was based, mingled with the Osirian theology of death and resurrection, with the Memphite theology centered on the creator god Ptah, and with dozens of local traditions from across the Nile Valley. The priesthood was a fundamental institution of Old Kingdom society, a class of specialists dedicated to the maintenance of the divine household, the temples and their associated rituals, and to the mediation between the human and the divine. In the Old Kingdom, the major priests were drawn largely from the royal family and the highest levels of the nobility, their appointment to temple positions a form of royal patronage that tied the religious establishment closely to the court. As the Old Kingdom progressed, however, the temples grew in wealth and influence, their endowments of land and labor becoming increasingly substantial, and the priestly class began to develop interests and ambitions of its own, somewhat apart from those of the royal house. The royal court itself was an intricate and hierarchically organized world, centered on the person of the pharaoh, but managed by an extensive bureaucracy of officials whose titles and responsibilities were carefully delineated, and whose relative status was expressed through everything from the size of their tombs to the quality of the limestone used in their burial chambers. The most important official in the land, after the pharaoh himself, was the vizier, or chati, the chief administrator of the royal household and the kingdom, responsible for overseeing the collection of taxes, the management of the irrigation system, the administration of justice, and the coordination of the great construction projects that were the most visible expression of royal power. The viziers of the Old Kingdom were men of extraordinary power and responsibility, and several of them have left behind substantial autobiographies, texts carved on the walls of their tombs that describe their careers and accomplishments in considerable detail, giving us some of our most intimate portraits of how the Old Kingdom state actually functioned from day to day. These autobiographies are remarkable documents, carefully crafted, self-conscious presentations of a life in service of the pharaoh, full of formulaic expressions of loyalty and duty, but also containing, here and there, flashes of genuine personality and specific detail that make the men who compose them feel vivid and real across the millennia. Below the vizier were ranks of officials with more specific responsibilities: the overseer of the treasury, the overseer of the granaries, the the overseer of works, who managed the construction projects, the chief steward of the royal household, and dozens of other positions with titles that tell us a great deal about the complexity and specialization of the Old Kingdom administrative system. All of these officials maintained their own households, their own staff of scribes and accountants, their own networks of patronage and obligation, and the social world of the Old Kingdom elite was one of considerable sophistication and refinement, a world of banquets and music, of hunting parties and river excursions, of elaborate tombs decorated with scenes of feasting and dancing and the pleasures of the afterlife. The tombs of the Old Kingdom elite, clustered around the royal pyramids in great necropolises at Saqqara and Giza and other sites, are among the most invaluable sources we have for understanding daily life in ancient Egypt. Unlike the royal tombs, which were sealed and inaccessible after the king's burial, the elite tombs were maintained as active cult sites, visited regularly by family members and priests who performed the rituals that kept the dead man's spirit nourished and comfortable in the afterlife. The walls of these tombs were decorated with scenes designed to replicate the comfortable world the deceased had enjoyed in life. Scenes of farming and fishing, of beer brewing and bread baking, of cattle being herded and geese being counted and craftsmen at their work, of musicians playing and dancers dancing and servants carrying platters of food to the eternal banquet. These scenes were not merely decorative. They were functional, magical in the ancient Egyptian sense, meaning that their very existence, properly inscribed on the walls of the tomb and activated by the appropriate rituals, was understood to ensure the continued availability of the things they depicted. The painted geese on the wall of the tomb were, in a real sense, a flock of actual geese available to the dead man in the afterlife. The painted loaves of bread were actual bread. The painted musicians would play their actual music for him forever. The image was the thing, properly understood, and the art of the Egyptian tomb was not representation, but provision, a way of furnishing the eternal home. The food offered at elite Old Kingdom tombs was sometimes supplemented by actual physical offerings, real bread and beer and cuts of meat left by the family and the funerary priests at the false door of the tomb, the slab of carved stone that served as the magical threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. These offerings were then understood to be absorbed by the spirit of the deceased through the medium of the false door, sustaining him in his eternal journey the way food had sustained him in his earthly one. Life in Old Kingdom Egypt, for those fortunate enough to inhabit its upper reaches, was a life of considerable comfort and cultural richness. Memphis was a great city by the standards of the ancient world, its population tens of thousands strong, its markets full of goods from across Egypt and beyond, its workshops producing the fine stone vessels and jewelry and furniture that filled the tombs of the elite. The Nile Valley was productive enough in these centuries before any serious environmental stress to generate substantial agricultural surpluses, and those surpluses were channeled by the royal administration into the great projects, the pyramids, the temples, the administrative infrastructure that gave the Old Kingdom its enduring character. The agricultural labours that produced these surpluses were organised, at least in part, through a system of corvée labour, obligatory service rendered to the state in lieu of taxes during the months of the inundation when the fields were flooded and the farmers were unable to work their land. It was this corvée labour system that provided the workforce for the great construction projects, and we now know, thanks to the discovery of the workers' village at Giza and to the administrative records and medical evidence found there, that the pyramid builders were not slaves, as was once assumed, but workers who were fed and housed and provided with medical care at the expense of the state, proud participants in a great national enterprise. The state organization required to feed, house, and manage tens of thousands of workers on a major pyramid project was itself a remarkable achievement, a demonstration of the administrative sophistication that the Old Kingdom had developed over its centuries of existence. The logistics of supplying the Giza workforce, the grain and beer and meat and vegetables, the medical care, the copper tools and the wooden sledges and the rope, the organization of the quarrying and transport of millions of limestone blocks represented a level of organizational complexity that was quite without precedent in the ancient world. And standing at the center of all of it, the pivot around which the entire system turned, was the pharaoh, the god-king, the son of Ra, the living embodiment of the divine order, looking out from his palace at Memphis across the flat plain toward the pyramid plateau where his eternal house was rising, stone by stone, toward the Egyptian sky. It was into this world of divine kings and solar theology, of bureaucratic sophistication and agricultural plenty, of tombs carved with scenes of eternal feasting and temples ringing with the chants of priests, that the greatest pyramid builders would step and do their extraordinary work. And that work, the pyramids of Giza, the greatest monuments ever raised by human hands, is waiting for us in part 3. The night is long, and the story is slow, and there is nowhere to be but here, in the soft darkness, listening to the world of the ancient Nile unfold at its own unhurried pace. Let the desert receive you. Let the river carry you forward. Rest.